Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Commercial Electrification training. I'm Courtney Anderson with Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And we're very excited about these trainings. We're kicking off the commercial series today. We developed these with our partners in community planning and development. I see a lot of people are still signing on, and I know that's how Zoom typically works. But we're going to go ahead and get started. There's a lot to get through today, so I'm going to start it off with handing it over to Linda Morrison in CPD.
Welcome everyone to today's presentation about commercial electrification. I'm Linda Morrison. I lead the energy review team for community planning and development. I'm delighted to be with you today to really get into the heart of this very important topic. After our prepared material, we'll have a question and answer session. Could we move over to the Q&A slide, please? Please type questions at any time using the Zoom Q&A feature. During the session, the moderator will say the questions out loud so our community planning and development panel can respond. If we're unable to answer your question in our time together today, we will answer it in email. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the website. Please join us for other training sessions in the series, either live or via the recorded session. And please help us get the word out by sharing what you've learned and links with your colleagues and interested people. We have a timeline to share with you that helps to recap Denver's plans and goals for commercial and multifamily buildings. The 2022 Denver Energy Code became effective on May 1st, and it's a step in a series of steps that take us to the ultimate goal of zero greenhouse gas emissions. Energy efficiency is very important, but that alone does not reach the goal. It's a combination of efficiency, electrification, and a greener grid that will take us to zero greenhouse gas emissions. This means we all have a part to play in making these changes and that we also have time to accomplish them incrementally. As building owners, designers, and contractors, we want today's presentation and subsequent conversations to help you prepare for what is ahead. Specifically, to point out the additional requirements for electrification of space and water heating shown in the third row that occur in 2025 and 2027. Our energy code includes input from a wide variety of community members and stakeholders, and a big thank you to all who contributed. You will find the full 2022 Denver Energy Code at denvergov.org/building code. We are releasing City Council approved code updates in June, so please check back for the latest. Denver-specific ComCheck and ResCheck are anticipated to be available in fall of 2023, and we'll share some tips on prescriptive compliance before that's available through training sessions next week on May 1st and June 1st. May 31st and June 1st. You'll find a wide array of additional resources at the Net Zero Energy Hub at denvergov.org/energy code. This includes specific provisions, compliance options, and additional trainings. More resources are being added in May and June, so be sure to check back. And you'll hear us use a single reference to a code section in the 2022 Denver Energy Code. This is because the 2022 Denver Building and Fire Code adopts the base code as reference. It's a good practice to check Denver's code first to see if there are deletions or modifications to a section, and then reference the base code. Now let's dive into today's presentation. Tom Gleason with the Office of Community Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency is our moderator, and Taylor Roberts with Group 14 Engineering is our presenter.
Great, thank you, Linda. So today we're really focusing on the electrification provisions in the 2022 Denver Energy Code. Linda already explained what makes up that energy code, and there's quite a few really key electrification highlights that we want to touch on today, make sure everyone has a high level understanding. And then also, there's several other trainings. So again, this is really focusing on those electrification items, other trainings including the different pathways for compliance and things like that will happen in the coming weeks. So today we're going to go over why electrification, why is it important, why is the city looking at it with the 2022 Denver Energy Code, both with some requirements and definitely a lot of incentives to electrify as well. We'll go through the specific provisions for space heating and water heating for electrification, talk about the additional electric infrastructure requirements in the energy code. We'll also cover C406 electrification options. For people that aren't familiar, C406 is the additional efficiency credit section of the code that you'll need to comply with if you're complying with the 2022 Denver Energy Code via the prescriptive pathway. And finally, we'll also go over resources available and how this all ties into Energize Denver, which is for existing buildings, not new construction like the 2022 Denver Energy Code. Also a note here, we'll have a little checklist in the top right of slides. If it's a prescriptive provision, prescriptive provisions need to be followed when you're following the prescriptive pathway. We'll have little exclamation mark in the top right if it's a requirement for all projects or mandatory regardless of code pathway. So starting off with why electrification. So the city of Denver has very strong goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that being completely eliminating them by 2040. So really aggressive goals there. If we're looking at where a lot of these greenhouse gases are coming from for the city, 64% of it is coming from buildings and homes, with the more single family residential homes making up 15% and commercial buildings and multifamily buildings making up 49% of those emissions. And to get to that goal of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, the city is looking at needing all new buildings and homes to be net zero energy by 2030 and all existing buildings and homes to be net zero energy by 2040. Now, it's really important to understand when the city is referencing net zero energy, that is not the typical definition, which would be, replacing all site energy use with site PV or renewable sources. The city's definition when we're referring to this is all electric, highly efficient, powered by on-site or off-site renewables, and having demand flexibility. So when we look at gas use in buildings that's resulting in all those greenhouse gas emissions we touched on earlier, the vast majority of it's coming from space heating, 67%, and then the other big piece of the pie being water heating at 30%, and finally your miscellaneous loads like cooking, clothes drying, fireplaces, etc., making up about 3%. What's really important about this is that the city is tackling these items with the highest priority, and we'll talk about that some more, but obviously space and water heating being the first priorities and some of those smaller miscellaneous loads falling a little bit in priority as they make up so much less of the gas use in buildings. So you can't talk about electrification to reduce carbon emissions unless that electricity is very, very clean. Thankfully, Xcel Energy has very strong goals as well around their carbon emissions for producing electricity. That first interim goal of 2030 is an 80% reduction, and the long-term goal of 2050 for 100% carbon-free electricity. So the grid is changing very, very rapidly. Low-emission electricity is coming extremely fast. And why that's so important is because gas, being a fossil fuel, inherently has carbon emissions associated with it, whereas electricity is that path to zero emissions with carbon-free electricity being in the future. So when we talk about electrifying, it always, grid utilization and grid capacity always come up. Xcel's working on this really hard as well. Xcel Energy is working on this really hard as well. But something that's really important too to understand is that the current peak in Denver is in the summer. typically on the hottest day, right, where we need the most air conditioning. And that wintertime peak is much, much smaller because most of that heating and domestic hot water heating is coming from gas sources and not electricity. As the grid or as buildings electrify, that will change, but it will take it will be a while until it does, right? So we'll need about 50% of buildings to have their heating and service hot water heating electrified before this becomes an issue. So Xcel Energy understands this and they're working on it. But they do have some time as well as this happens. Another important note is, a lot of specific projects might have issues with capacity and rumors fly around. A lot of that too is due to Denver's growth, right? In certain areas, not necessarily having capacity for large growth, which is different from what we're looking at with electrification. So as I mentioned several times, to hit Xcel Energy's goals, they're looking at a lot of different things and working in conjunction with Denver as well. We talked about the grid capacity planning. Xcel Energy also has several fantastic incentive programs, support for help on all these things as well that you can find. And they're, like I said, working really closely with Denver and Denver's goals, and supporting Denver's goals with their goals for decarbonizing the grid. So all electricity generators in Colorado are regulated by the Public Utility Commission. So the Public Utility Commission is really important. It's obviously looking at electrification as well and how it will impact utilities. So there's several plans that are being reviewed by the Public Utility Commission for beneficial electrification, transportation electrification, etc. This is all happening right now, and it's really important. So if you want to help support Denver's Public Utility Commission advocacy efforts, please reach out. Electrification@denvergov.org is a great resource to reach out to and help making sure that we're ready to electrify. And we can't talk about electrification without talking about heat pumps. Heat pumps are really a key part of this puzzle. When we use a traditional fossil fuel for heating, the maximum efficiency we can achieve is around 95% with like a condensing type piece of equipment. Heat pumps, instead of using combustion for heat, they are just moving heat using electricity, right? So they're pulling heat from somewhere and discharging it somewhere else. Because of that, they have a coefficient of performance which over the course of a year is around 200 to 300% higher than that of traditional gas equipment. There's also been huge gains for heat pumps in what we like to call cold climate heat pumps, or sometimes referred to as low ambient heat pumps, which essentially are air source heat pumps that can pull heat from really, really cold outdoor air, which is really important in Denver as we have cold winters. And these heat pumps are still able to run the refrigeration cycle and move that heat into the home or building as cold as -10 degrees. And even though just recently there's been a lot of advancements with heat pumps, they've been around forever, right? A heat pump is a refrigeration cycle that can run in reverse. They've been used since the 1800s, and they're used in all different types of applications. So it's not a new technology, it's just getting better and better. And also heat pumps have been very commonly used in areas of the US where natural gas heating might be more expensive or harder to come by, and electricity is more affordable. So they've been used for a long time in those instances, and then also throughout the world in Asia and Europe. A vital part of the electrification for Denver as well is improving equity. There's several ways it can do this. The first being lowering the energy utility bills by electrifying efficiently. So when we're using those heat pumps, not electric resistance, we can actually lower utility bills and then instead of having them go up. As I kept saying, you know, a heat pump inherently has the refrigeration cycle. So buildings that might not have had air conditioning when utilizing a heat pump will have air conditioning, which really helps with comfort during the summer. Also, you know, with combustion, you have pollutants, especially carbon monoxide, that can be an issue. So removing gas equipment improves indoor air quality in the homes, which is really fantastic as well. So again, this is just the summary. The primary driver for electrification being reducing emissions, but there's also several fantastic incentives and tax credit options. You can improve indoor air quality, improving equity in Denver. And then it's also really helping buildings to future-proof for Energize Denver and ensuring they're complying for the long term. Great, so that's kind of that high-level overview, and now I want to dive into the specific electrification requirements in the 2022 Denver Energy Code. So the first one being partial electrification for space heating. This is an interesting provision in the code because it did not go into effect when the 2022 Denver Energy Code was adopted. It is delayed slightly to align with Energize Denver. So it goes into effect January 1st of 2024. So any permits being submitted prior to that January 1st, 2024 date will need to comply with this provision. Any permits being submitted prior to that will not have to, and it is the submission date of the permit that is important, not when the permit is accepted and approved by the city. So what this provision reads here is fossil fuel, warm air furnaces, and electric resistant space heating equipment are not permitted for space heating. This is a mandatory requirement per that exclamation mark in the top right. So it does not matter if you're complying prescriptively or through the performance pathways, you will need to comply with this. There are several exceptions that you can see on the right of the slide here. Some notable ones being emergency power, makeup air systems where you cannot do an ERV due to the Denver Mechanical Code. You can use some electric resistance, as you can see, but can't be the primary source of heating. And buildings that use the performance pathway can use electric resistance heating if they're still complying with the requirements. Being there, just allowing you to be flexible, right? You could do like a passive house level insulated building and use electric resistance and comply. So making sure there's that flexibility. Again, so allowed gas equipment and electric resistance equipment, still some very common items that you can use. So gas boilers will still be allowed under this provision. Gas unit heaters, gas infrared radiant heaters, and then electric reheat within like a VAV box. All those items will still be allowed. So we kind of went over with the example of those allowed ones. Yeah, unit heaters, fossil fuel or electric. Again, boilers, fossil fuel or electric, radiant type heating, and electric reheat and VAV boxes. These are all examples, so there's obviously more. This is just to get a high level understanding, and please reference the code and the exceptions to understand at a higher or at a deeper level, excuse me. But some prohibited examples, right, being furnaces. So your residential style furnace would not be allowed. Gas rooftop units or RTUs using gas as that heating source would not be allowed. Same with dedicated outside air systems or makeup air units using gas as that primary source, as well as like an electric resistance fan coil unit or an electric resistance PTAC or VTAC would not be allowed. Now note, that we put the asterisks on those items that do have exceptions. So in some cases, they may be allowed. But in general, those will be the items that will be prohibited under this new requirement. So when looking to comply with this, we wanted to make sure there were options, to go over the options that you can comply with. So we have substitution options, either that one-for-one quick replacement or more whole system that you would design a different system due to this. So one-for-one replacement, right? If you have like a furnace with split AC, you could replace that with a split BX heat pump with a fan coil. So very similar, but you're using that heat pump instead of the gas or electric resistance heating. You can use for the rooftop units, the dedicated outside air systems, the makeup air units, any of that type of system, you can use a heat pump with electric resistance backup. Note there that you cannot use gas backup, so it would need to be an all-electric option for those. And then for P-tax and V-tax, they're very commonly available with heat pump heating and electric resistance backup, so you could utilize those options. If you're looking at more of a whole system change, these are typically higher efficiency type systems, but you could utilize any of the heat pumps being water source, ground source, or you could even look at a central air-cooled heat pump that provides chilled water and hot water, a heat recovery chiller, or sometimes referred to as a 6-pipe chiller that again provides hot water and chilled water via electric means. And then finally, VRF systems, that being either air-cooled or water-cooled. Note that there is this supplementary heat controls requirement as well. The point of this requirement is just really to ensure that the heat pump is being used as the primary source of heating in a heat pump system, and that supplementary, or I just refer to it as backup heat, is only being used when the heat pump can't meet load. If there's an issue, like the vapor compression cycle malfunctions, it's in defrost mode, or if there's another issue with the thermostat. So really only in emergency situations, or again, when the heat pump can't meet load, which we talked about is necessary still sometimes on a really cold day that you need that electric resistance supplementary heat. Great, so with that, we're going to move on to water heating, partial electrification for water heating. This is a very similar provision as the previous one we just went over. The focus here, though, is on water heating equipment instead of space heating, right? So same effective date. It is not effective right now, but it will be for any permits submitted after January 1st of 2024. This is really targeting fossil fuel and electric resistance, instantaneous and storage water heaters. Those will not be allowed. And again, this is aligning with the Energize Denver requirements. You can see there's a lot of exceptions, so make sure you're referencing the code to see all the exceptions, some notable ones being that electric resistance backup for heat pumps. If you have certain temperatures that you're required to hit, if you're using a renewable form of solar thermal, so several of those. And again, we have that same one where you can use electric resistance if you're complying with the performance path and the total building is still meeting the performance path requirements of the 2022 Denver Energy Code. So again, these lists are just examples to give you an idea, reference the code in detail if something you're curious about is not covered here. But the allowed equipment still very similar, right? Boilers are still allowed, so that larger central fossil fuel or electric boiler can still be used to provide domestic water heating. Heat pump water heaters, either individual or central, are really the ideal scenario to use here because that sets you up for Energize Denver as well by electrifying. So those are both allowed. again, on the prohibited equipment, these are just examples. And the asterisk means there are some exceptions related to those specific ones. But essentially, right, I already covered this, gas storage or instantaneous and electric resistance storage or instantaneous will not be allowed unless meeting an exception. So for substitution options, we again, 1-for-1, that heat pump water heater can be replaced 1-for-1 for most individual style gas or electric resistance water heaters. If you're looking at whole system, right, a central boiler could be used if in like a multifamily setting in lieu of individual style water heaters. You can have that with or without separate storage. A central heat pump water heater with electric resistance backup would also meet that and be all electric, which sets you up again for Energize Denver. Anytime though we're talking about heat pump water heaters, it is really important to consider all the different design constraints. You know, when you're introducing a heat pump, it needs to pull heat from somewhere, so it needs air to pull that heat from, and then it's going to discharge that air much colder in like an air conditioned state. So you need to be accommodating that. They're also larger. You have that whole refrigeration cycle within the unit. So they're bigger than like a traditional gas or an electric resistant water heater. And then you also need to be considering that heat pump operating temperature, right? The heat pump might turn off at a certain temperature, not be able to pull heat from the outside air. So you need that electric resistance backup to still provide domestic hot water during those times. So there's another provision in the code around demand response water heating. So demand response is when the utility goes into a peak demand event, they can send a signal to pieces of equipment that have to be signed up for these programs, right? The utility can't control your equipment unless you voluntarily sign up. But if you do so, they send that signal and it can turn off certain pieces of equipment to reduce that demand event. Xcel Energy has been doing this with condensers for air conditioning for a while now, and they are obviously incentivizing customers to do it with typically with some credit on their bill. But water heaters are really the ideal situation for this because they're essentially little batteries, right? They're heating water, storing it in a tank, and then you can use that water and not necessarily have to turn on the water heater to replenish that until that peak event would be over. So this is just setting up so that all water heaters are set up to be able to be used in demand response. It's specifically looking at electric storage water heaters from 40 to 120 gallons. That would be an electric resistance or heat pump water heater with an input rating less than 12 kW. And you essentially just when using these, you'll need to make sure it has that level 1 demand responsive controls. There are some exceptions, like if you need really hot water temperature or if you use 3-phase power, but this is really just setting it up so that those pieces of equipment that are really good at demand response can do so in the future if the customer desires. So those are the two major electrification provisions, being the space heating and water heating. Now we're going to go into electric ready infrastructure provision. So the idea behind this provision is that when you're putting in gas equipment right now that is totally allowed, it's just adding some easy things to ensure that when that piece of equipment runs its useful life and needs to be replaced, it can be replaced with an electric equivalent without requiring significant retrofit to do so. So with the gas equipment, right, you'll need to install a junction box, raceway, bus bar, panel space, and labeling saying it's for electric equipment. to comply with this. It affects water heating, small water heating equipment, right? Less than 300 MBH, so more that individual style. Warm air furnaces serving spaces without cooling. If you have an air conditioning unit, that can be easily retrofitted into a heat pump in the future, so you don't need to do this. But if you don't, this provision wants to ensure that that's available. Typical gas equipment like fireplaces, ranges, stoves that are residential as well as commercial cooking appliances, and then any other fossil fuel appliances or equipment serving dwelling units or sleeping units. So again, what does this mean? It's future proofing those gas pieces of equipment to ensure that they can be retrofitted easily in the future. And the fossil fuel appliances and equipment that you're installing in your right now need to have this extra electric infrastructure to be future proofed. The electrical drawings need to have it clearly labeled and shown that you're meeting the requirement. An electrical plan review will check that the loads are reasonable for that switch out in the future. And just to note as well, right, that when installing a gas piece of equipment, you're going to have to add in the cost for this additional electric infrastructure, which may or may not add costs, but if it does, might provide further incentive to just go electric now instead of doing the gas and future proofing. Another provision on the water heating equipment locations. So when required by the previous additional electric infrastructure provision, that we just covered, you also need to comply with this. So with those smaller more individual style water heaters, the whole point of this provision is ensuring that it can be that individual water heater can be replaced with a heat pump style water heater in the future. So as we noted in those design considerations, they're a little bigger. So you need to have a certain size for that closet for the water heater, or you need to have a grill and duct work to allow for that pulling air or exhausting air. Some exceptions would be really tiny water heaters, smaller than 20 gallons of storage, instantaneous within 10 feet of the point of use for the hot water. Or you can also, if you're future proofing around a specific manufacturer's heat pump water heater, you can do those recommendations if they're different than this requirement. Great, so now I want to touch on the C406 additional efficiency credits that specifically relate to electrification. As I mentioned previously, there will be other trainings on the prescriptive pathway in the 2022 Denver Energy Code that will go into much more detail on C406 in general. This is just going to be touching on those electrification options within it. Really high level for C406 is that you'll need to achieve a certain number of credits based on the building type of your building. And these are the credits that you can achieve if you look at electrifying. So the first one being electric space heating. Again, this does not mean the building is all electric. It means that your space heating is all electric. So there's certain requirements around the amount of electric resistance you have for VAV reheat or other electric resistance, being for VAV reheat less than 5 watts per square foot, and other electric resistance being less than 1.35 watts per square foot of your conditioned floor area. Again, essentially pushing heat pumps, right? So if you're electric and heat pumps should be able to achieve this credit. Your electric resistance for your backup for your heat pump does not count towards any of that. Any freeze protection or heated plenums do not count either. So if you are looking at all electric space heating, you can see for the different occupancy types on the table on the right, you get those different credits. So pretty significant, 4 to 9 credits available for those different building types. Cold climate heat pumps is another one related to electrification of space heating. We kind of discussed what a cold climate heat pump was earlier. This is very specific around the requirements. So if you have a PTAC or a VTAC, the COP needs to remain above a 1.5 at 5 degrees outdoor air temperature. And if you have a different heat pump, like a split DX heat pump or a water source heat pump, etc., it needs to have a COP of 1.75 or higher at 5-degree outdoor air temperature. Again, you have a limit to the amount of electric resistance you can use in the conditioned floor area. And then you can see the credits, again, fairly significant on the right. Just to give some background on the credits as well, you know, for like a multifamily building that is not all electric, you would need about 40 credits. For an office building that is not all electric, you would need 31. Again, that'll be dived into in much more detail in other trainings, but just to give you a background on how impactful like 9 points might be for one of these provisions. So 2 heating electric provision credit options. There's 2 service hot water options as well. This first one being service hot water by a heat pump, being provided by a heat pump. So it's more specific on building types. So it's really only allowed for building types that have significant service hot water loads, and where you know, electric resistance is allowed, but you're using a heat pump water heater. And 2 other key requirements would be that the EF is 3.0 or higher, and that air source heat pumps shall not draw conditioned air from within the building for this credit. But you can see the credit points or the credits on the right that you can achieve based on the different building types. And finally, the last one being all electric water heating that matches space heating is similar to the space heating provision. Again, you don't need the whole building to be all electric, just your water heating needs to be all electric. Again, pretty simple credit here, right? It's just saying all your service water heating must be provided by electric equipment. If so, you can achieve significant points. You can see up to 13 points based on building type at the table. So those were the 4 C406 electrification credit options. Now I want to dive into some resources for new and existing buildings for electrification. The first one being the new building electrification pilot. So there's a pilot program that the city of Denver is putting on that can provide funding for building new all electric buildings. In exchange for the funding, the pilot agrees to be a case study. The city is really looking at utilizing these case studies to provide great information to the design community for designing, constructing all electric buildings. That might include drawings, MEP specs, reviewing lessons learned, etc. So if you have a good project that's looking like they might want to try going all electric, please apply at denvergov.org/net0. Another important thing to note here is that there is an equity focus with 50% of the pilot project funds being prioritized for affordable housing or serving under-resourced communities in Denver. There's also a great landing page on the City of Denver's website, denvergov.org/building electrification, for existing building support and resources, specifically having to do with Energize Denver. So make sure you look at this website and go through these resources. Really, really helpful. If you have more questions, you can always reach out at the 2 different emails here as well, ask more specific questions around the electrification feasibility reports or permitting and code compliance. So finally, I want to touch on Energize Denver, the existing buildings electrification program, and how this comes into effect with everything we talked about today with the 2022 Denver Energy Code and the electrification provisions. So people that aren't familiar, Energize Denver has a couple of different requirements for existing buildings that are in operation within the city and county of Denver. The first being you need to report your utility bill and energy usage to the city. And then by 2030, that will also hit a target. We're not going to focus on those two provisions. We're going to focus on the electrification provision within Energize Denver. So this chart is really showing the timeline of that electrification provision. It's kind of broken up into two different items: easy to electrify equipment and harder to electrify equipment. And with the easy to electrify equipment, more requirements happening faster, and those harder to electrify pieces of equipment kind of being delayed slightly in this timeline. So the first item being AC condensing units serving a heated space, gas furnaces, gas water heaters. Those will get into the nitty gritty on the details, but if you're replacing those and looking for a permit, you'll need to do some additional things to get that permit to replace it with a gas piece of equipment. This starting this year, so this is already in effect. Then in 2025, those same easy to electrify pieces of equipment will need to be replaced with an electric equivalent when cost effective. And then those harder to electrify pieces of equipment, PTACs, VTACs, boilers, central hot water systems, those will be similar to what the easy ones are right now, which is they have additional requirements, but you can still replace them with a gas equivalent, with a gas piece of equipment in 2025. And then finally, in 2027, all the gas equipment will need to be replaced with an electric equivalent when cost effective. So really important to note there, due to these Energize Denver requirements, the permitting for this replacement has changed. No longer will you be able to do a quick permit because of needing to meet these other requirements. The permit will need to be reviewed by plan review. And we'll talk about in detail your options for the other requirements. One of them is an electrification feasibility report, which we'll go over. And then just note again, right, that there's the two different timelines based on equipment. So boilers are not affected until 2025. So electrification feasibility reports, as I alluded to, can be provided to meet some of the requirements we'll go over in the next few slides. The goal of these are to really assess the feasibility of the electric heat pump replacement for the retrofit, looking at the installed cost, the annual energy cost change, and the social cost of carbon dioxide over the life of the equipment. There's great trainings on newdaynewcode.com on these, as well as a tool on the City of Denver's website, denvergov.org/building electrification, to help out with these reports. All right, so I kept saying it, but these are the requirements effective March 1st, 2023, right? So when replacing that gas-fired furnace with another gas-fired furnace, you must do two of the following. You can still do the gas furnace, but you have to include either an electrification feasibility report, the right sizing of equipment, or performing leak testing of all gas pipes. Again, choose two of those three options. And then that new fossil fuel furnace must meet one of the different options here, either efficiency higher than 90%, or looking at the nitrogen dioxide emissions requirement. So notable, there's some exceptions to these, right? Emergency equipment being that big one. Again, boilers not until 2025. So some key items there. The other pieces of equipment that fall under this currently are the unitary air conditioners or condensing units serving a heated space. When you're replacing with another air conditioner or condensing unit, you need to provide one of the following, either that electrification feasibility report or right sizing of the equipment. And then similar for gas-fired storage water heaters or instantaneous water heaters being replaced with, again, a gas piece of equipment, you need to provide one of the following: electrification feasibility report or leak testing of all gas pipes. Again, emergency equipment being that big exception. Just to know, if you are replacing that piece of gas equipment with an electric heat pump, you don't need to do any of those additional requirements, but it will still take a full permit to go through, similar to if you're replacing with gas. You just don't have to do those additional requirements. So that covers everything. I think now we'll transition into the question and answer part of the presentation.
Thanks, Taylor. And just as a reminder, please use the Q&A feature to drop in your questions. And we have a number of questions in here. Let's see. So I think I'm going to ask Sam Domeyer on our electrification team. We have a few questions where people are asking, when replacing equipment in existing buildings, who determines what is cost effective, or kind of what is the definition? I think we have like 4 different people who've asked that question. So Sam, the folks would love to know, how are we qualifying cost effective?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Tom, and thanks everyone. What I'll do is actually drop the link to the Energize Denver ordinance into the Q&A so y'all can reference it. But basically, it's looking at costs within 5 to 15% of the gas like for like option. And so if it's above 15%, that is when something would be deemed not cost effective. And that is the point at which the electrification would not necessarily be required. But it's a good question. I'll drop in some more details to the chat so people can read it for themselves.
Okay. And so this maybe is a tricky one, but let's see if we can answer Lynn's question. What is the effect on restaurants or food service venues where gas cooking is common? Maybe one of my CPD peers can help out with that one.
Yeah, hi, it's Linda Morrison. And just as far as gas cooking equipment, that is not something that is covered under our code. So it's not something that's required to be electrified either in replacement equipment or new buildings. It does make a difference on whether the property is considered an all electric property, but that's the only thing.
Thank you, Linda. I think this may have been answered earlier, but I saw a question asking, does this apply only to new construction?
So the requirements for equipment replacement require that some of the, the electrification study, testing of gas pipes, and sizing would be required, but that's it. It changes the permit methodology. So the rest of the requirements around electric or space heating and water heating are only for new construction.
Thank you, Linda.
I was just going to add a quick note, Tom, on that the 2022 Denver Energy Code, right, has new construction, additions, alterations, and change of use. So depending on where you fall under those different definitions, that could be where some of these provisions may or may not apply. So just understanding those definitions within the code.
Yeah, good clarification, Taylor. Okay, and the questions keep flowing in. Great job, everybody. So when building new multifamily, does pool heating equipment need to be all electric?
Chuck, would you care to take that one?
Yeah, no, pool heating does not fall under service water heating. So it is not going to be required to be all electric.
Chuck, this might be you as well. Does ComCheck determine if systems are right-sized or not?
No, ComCheck is not does not look at building loads and provide right sizing equipment. Chapter 4 of the Energy Code has specific sections that either the ACA manual, it's section C403, but there's specific requirements for right sizing equipments and how you determine the loads and then how you do right size the equipment based on those loads. And it's spelled out in chapter 4 of the IECC.
And we have another restaurant question. So gas hot water heaters are included in the code, even though gas cooking is not, correct? And I think we addressed that, but Linda, maybe just give us a nod there.
That is correct. Yeah, gas cooking equipment is not regulated in the code, and gas in this energy code for electrification, gas water heaters are, you would need to follow the code for those, definitely.
Will these questions and answers be available? That's a good question, Craig. So it's my understanding that y'all can see the Q&A responses if we answer it publicly. So, and a recording of this entire training, including the verbal responses, will be available and posted online. So in the coming weeks, we hope to have this training as well as other recorded trainings on our website, denvergov.org/energycode. Okay, what else do we have on here? Oh, here's a long one. Jeffrey Engelstad, for larger boiler systems and central utility plants that are installed with gas, are there guidelines for the increase in electric service that will be required for electric ready? This could add additional electrical services and gear to these builds that are based on speculative future loads if electric ready needs to be accounted for from the electric service through distribution panels to a labeled junction box in the area. Policy or guidelines for these CUP style systems would be useful for large commercial projects. So that was a long one. Who wants to take that one on?
So the additional electrification infrastructure has some requirements, and basically if the water heating is over 300,000 BTU, the electrification infrastructure is not required. And so a large boiler system like that would be outside of that 300,000. So the additional electric infrastructure would not be required for those large central systems.
Thank you, Chuck. And Amanda asked my favorite question of the day. Is there still space within the new building electrification pilot for more projects to apply? And the answer is yes. We would encourage anyone and everyone who has an exciting new project to share with us to apply. So check out the website. We'll be posting this this recording and the slides. So slides have a link to that, or you can just visit our website. Okay, and Adam's got a question. Just to be clear, depending on if my building is submitting for permit in 2024 or earlier, I only need to account for either the 2022 Denver Energy Code or Energize Denver, not for both, since Energy Code basically mandates electrification today versus Energize Denver suggesting it at equipment end of life, correct? I could take a stab at answering this one, but I'd probably get it wrong. Anyone feel more confident than Tom? Okay, we're going to go Tom for the first stab at this. So Adam, not quite correct. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. The 2022 Denver Energy Code should set you up for success with the Energize Denver requirements. There's two facets of Energize Denver. There's building performance, and then there's equipment replacement. So in terms of equipment replacement, it should set you up for success there. And then building performance, again, hopefully, your building is built to a standard that will set you up for success and compliance with the Energize Denver performance requirements. But every building is a little bit different, and how you operate it also impacts how the building performs. So close, but still keep an eye on building performance and how you're operating that facility. And I'll pause to see if any of my peers want to add to that.
Yeah, so I'll just add that so in 2024, the electrification requirements are for new systems going into buildings and new construction. So and then the energy code requirements that are based on the Energize Denver electrification requirements only affect the replacement of existing gas systems. So if you had a building with an addition and you're replacing the existing gas systems in the existing building, and then you have a new system serving the addition, both could actually apply. So the 2024 January 1, 2024 requirements are for new systems going into buildings, new construction. The Energize Denver electrification requirements are for focus solely on the replacement of existing gas systems.
And we're seeing a flurry of questions come in. We got 3 minutes left, so we'll see what we can get to. And if we don't answer your question live, we'll be sure to follow up offline. So James wants to know, when building a new multifamily building, would any of the following gas equipment require additional electric infrastructure? Outdoor kitchen, so for barbecuing, outdoor fire pits, or amenity fireplace?
So section C405.15 in the Denver Energy Code identifies all locations where additional electric infrastructure is required. And so quickly, outdoor barbecues, no. Outdoor fire pits, no. Amenity fireplace, yes. So that's the quick answer to that question.
Right. Let's see. So there's a question. So electric hot water with storage and electric hot water that are on demand are allowed? Question mark.
So section C in January 1, right now they're allowed. January 1, 2024, the on-demand water heaters will be allowed only if they're within 10 feet of the fixture being served. And the electric resistance water heater would only be allowed if you're using the performance path and can justify that the building still meets the performance targets using the electric resistance water heaters.
Okay, and I think we are at time. Thank you, everybody, for all of your questions. Like I said, if we didn't get to them, we will make sure to answer your questions and get back to you. We appreciate you joining us. This is the first in the series of commercial trainings. We also have a series of residential trainings. So we hope you'll either join us tomorrow for the residential training or see us again next week when we dive back into commercial energy code. So thanks again for being with us. And with that, I think we're going to call this a wrap.